There are people born not to live quietly, but to carry memory when silence would be easier. They arrive in the world already watched, already measured, already expected to fail. Long before their names are spoken, a question follows them like a shadow: will they bow, or will they stand? This story begins in that shadow, in a world where dignity was weighed by outsiders who did not know its true measure. Before the world learned his name, Africa was already old with wisdom. Long before foreign maps were drawn, the land remembered its own order. Gold moved through hands that understood balance. Knowledge passed from elder to child without written permission. Faith and learning walked together, not as ornaments, but as foundations. Yet, beyond the horizon, others told a smaller story, one that shrank Africa into rumor and resource. In such a world, greatness was dangerous. To rise too high meant becoming a target. To remain unseen meant being erased. Between those two fates stood one man, shaped not only by inheritance, but by responsibility. He did not ask to represent a people. History placed that burden on his shoulders and waited to see what he would do. This is not a story about riches piled in vaults. It is not a story about spectacle or excess. It is the story of a man forced to decide what wealth was truly for. When power came to him, it did not arrive gently. It demanded restraint when cruelty was easier. It demanded vision when fear would have sufficed. It demanded faith in people when domination promised faster results. Every generation is tested by moments when the past looks to the present for an answer. In his time, that answer took the form of a ruler who understood that standing upright was not arrogance, but duty. He would soon walk roads that led beyond his homeland, into the eyes of a world unprepared for what it would see. If you listen to the end of this story, you will not only hear about a king, you will hear about a choice to be more than what others allowed, a choice to show, without shouting, that Africa did not need permission to exist with dignity. This is why his memory endures, not as a legend of gold, but as a lesson in standing firm. Before the world ever spoke his name, Mali already knew itself. This was not a land waiting to be discovered, but a land that had been remembering for generations. Long before strangers arrived with questions and measures, order lived in the soil, in the rhythm of trade, and in the shared understanding of responsibility. Wealth here was not hoarded in silence. It moved. It fed families, built trust, and kept balance between people and land. Gold was never the beginning of Mali's story. It was only one voice in a larger chorus. Salt traveled beside it, as valuable as breath in dry lands. Knowledge moved with equal care, carried by elders who understood that memory was survival. Faith was not forced, and learning was not hidden. These things lived openly, passed hand to hand like tools meant to be used, not displayed. Beyond these borders, another story was being told, a smaller one, a story that reduced Africa to distance and rumor, to riches without reason, to power without discipline. Those who told it did not see cities that breathed with life. They did not see systems that held people together without chains. They saw only what they wanted to take. Inside Mali, leadership was not theater. A ruler was expected to protect balance, not dominate it. Authority came with limits. A king who forgot his people would not stand long in memory, no matter how much gold passed through his hands. This understanding shaped the world that raised Mansa Musa, even before he knew the weight he would one day carry. He did not grow in a vacuum of comfort. He grew inside expectation. Every decision made by those before him taught the same lesson. Power without wisdom destroys itself. The land remembered rulers who failed that test, and it remembered them without mercy. In Mali, memory was honest. This was the inheritance Mansa Musa received before he ever touched a crown. Not just wealth, but responsibility layered over time. Not just authority, but the quiet knowledge that leadership was watched by ancestors as much as by the living. In such a world, a man learned early that standing tall was not about pride. It was about duty. So when the moment came for him to step forward, he carried more than bloodline. He carried the memory of a civilization that had never asked to be defined by outsiders. The world beyond Mali did not yet understand this. But soon, it would be forced to learn that Africa had never been empty, never been silent, and never been waiting to be told who it was. Power did not come to Mansa Musa through celebration. It came through absence. A ruler before him had looked westward, toward the edge of the great ocean, convinced that the world did not end where fear said it did. He left with ships and men, gold and provisions, and a certainty that discovery mattered more than comfort. Before departing, he placed the weight of the kingdom on Mansa Musa's shoulders, not as a gift, but as a trust, when the ships never returned. Silence answered the horizon. No proclamation followed, no triumphant return, only the slow understanding that leadership had changed hands without ceremony. Mansa Musa did not seize the throne. He remained standing when others were gone. In Mali, that distinction mattered. Becoming ruler under such circumstances shaped the man he would become. He did not inherit power as destiny. He accepted it as obligation. There was no illusion of safety in his rise. If the kingdom faltered, history would remember him not as caretaker, but as failure. The land did not excuse hesitation. He ruled knowing that his authority rested not only on lineage, but on trust. The people watched him closely, as did the memory of rulers before him. In a society where oral history carried truth forward, every action would be repeated long after his voice was gone. To govern carelessly was to invite lasting judgment. Mansa Musa learned early that leadership was not about presence, but endurance. He could not rely on fear alone, for fear collapses when tested. He could not rely on wealth alone, for wealth attracts enemies faster than loyalty. He needed something steadier, something that outlived moments. This was the moment when he understood that he was no longer a private man. His choices would ripple outward, shaping how Mali was remembered and how Africa would be spoken of beyond its borders. He stood at a threshold where retreat was impossible. To step back would fracture order. To step forward meant carrying the expectations of many lives. There is no record of him doubting aloud, but history often hides doubt inside discipline. The absence of complaint does not mean the absence of weight. Mansa Musa carried his burden quietly, aware that the role he now occupied belonged not to him alone, but to generations. In that stillness after succession, before grand journeys and distant recognition, he made his most important decision. He chose to remain, he chose to govern, and by choosing responsibility over escape, he crossed from being a man of promise into a man of consequence. From that moment on, nothing he did would belong only to him. Once authority settled fully on Mansa Musa, he faced a choice that many rulers never paused to consider. He could rule through fear, tightening his grip until obedience replaced trust. Or he could rule through understanding, a slower path that demanded patience and self-control. Mali was already strong. The question was, what kind of strength it would become. He chose knowledge. This decision was not decorative. It was structural. Mansa Musa understood that an empire built only on force fractures the moment force weakens. But an empire built on learning carries itself forward even when rulers change. He believed that people who could read the world could not easily be broken by it. Under his guidance, centers of learning were not treated as luxuries. They were treated as necessities. Faith and scholarship were encouraged to grow side by side, not as competing loyalties, but as shared disciplines. Study was not removed from daily life. It was woven into it. Timbuktu did not rise because of chance. It rose because a ruler invested trust in minds rather than intimidation of bodies. Teachers were valued. Students traveled long distances, not because they were forced, but because the city promised something rare: respect for thought. Books mattered. Conversation mattered. Memory mattered. This form of leadership carried risk. Educated people ask questions. They notice inconsistency. They hold leaders accountable. Mansa Musa accepted this risk because he understood something many feared. Ignorance was far more dangerous than inquiry. Silence could be controlled, but it could not sustain a civilization. He did not abandon discipline. Law remained firm. Order remained clear. But fear was not the foundation. Dignity was. By choosing this path, he placed himself under the same expectations he placed on others. A ruler who values knowledge must live transparently enough to withstand it. This decision reshaped Mali's reputation far beyond its borders. Travelers spoke not only of gold, but of libraries and scholars. They spoke of cities where learning moved freely. Slowly, a different image formed in distant minds, one that did not fit old assumptions. For Mansa Musa, this was the point of no return. Once he chose to govern through intellect and faith, he accepted a heavier burden. He could no longer rule by instinct alone. He had to rule by example. From that moment forward, every action he took would either affirm or betray the vision he had chosen, and the world was watching. When Mansa Musa began his journey toward Mecca, the roads did not tremble from conquest. They shifted from recognition. This was not a march of domination, but a movement so deliberate, so disciplined, that it could not be ignored. Thousands traveled with him, not as a spectacle, but as a living expression of order, wealth, and restraint moving together. Those who saw the procession did not only count numbers, they felt presence. Gold appeared, but it did not shout. It was given calmly, generously, as if abundance were natural rather than performative. Markets changed, prices bent, economies adjusted around a man who treated giving not as strategy, but as obligation. History had never seen generosity on this scale move so quietly. In Cairo and beyond, rulers accustomed to being the center of the world suddenly found themselves observing instead. Mansa Musa showed respect without surrender. He honored faith without diminishing himself. By bowing to belief, he stood taller before men. That balance unsettled many who believed power must always announce itself loudly. The most lasting effect of this journey was not written in ledgers. It was written in memory. People spoke of an African ruler who did not arrive pleading for legitimacy. He arrived already complete. His wealth disrupted markets, but his discipline disrupted assumptions. The world realized that Africa was not merely a source of riches. It was a place of structure, learning, and moral confidence. Yet even generosity carries consequence. The sudden flow of gold weakened its value. Mansa Musa later worked to repair what his giving had unintentionally damaged, borrowing back wealth to restore balance. In doing so, he revealed another truth about leadership. Responsibility does not end with good intentions. It extends to repair. By the time he returned home, his name traveled ahead of him. Maps would later show him holding gold, but those images missed the deeper reality. He had carried Mali into global awareness without declaring supremacy. He had done so by walking a spiritual road with political gravity. From this journey onward, he could never return to obscurity. His actions had widened the world's lens. Africa could no longer be spoken of, quietly or vaguely. The pilgrimage marked a turning point, not only for Mali, but for how history would be forced to remember the continent. Mansa Musa had not asked the world to watch. He simply walked forward, and the world followed. After the pilgrimage, Mansa Musa returned to Mali changed by what the world had made of him. He had not sought attention, yet attention now followed him like a second shadow. His name was spoken far beyond his borders, often without understanding, sometimes with admiration, sometimes with fear. He had become a measure against which Africa itself was judged. This was the quiet cost of standing too tall. Every action he took afterward was no longer read as policy, but as symbol. When Mali prospered, people credited his gold. When challenges appeared, they questioned his legacy. Complexity was flattened into expectation. A man became an image, and an image leaves little room for rest. Inside his own land, the weight grew heavier. To rule an empire is demanding. To rule while carrying the gaze of the world is exhausting. Mansa Musa could no longer afford ordinary mistakes. He governed knowing that failure would not be treated as human error, but as confirmation of outside doubt. The margin for imperfection vanished. There is no record of bitterness, but leadership rarely leaves such things behind. The loneliness of responsibility does not announce itself. It settles quietly, in decisions made without counsel, in nights spent balancing stability against vision. Mansa Musa bore this silently, because silence was part of the price of being believed. His generosity, once praised, was now scrutinized. His strength, once admired, was now tested against impossible standards. To some, he was proof of African greatness. To others, he was an exception they hoped would fade. In both cases, he was no longer seen simply as a man. Yet, even under this pressure, he did not retreat into cruelty or isolation. He continued to govern with discipline. He continued to invest in order. He continued to choose dignity over spectacle. This consistency mattered more than acclaim. It kept Mali stable, while the world argued over what it had witnessed. The greatest burden he carried was not wealth, but representation. He stood where few had stood before, knowing that if he fell, the fall would echo beyond his lifetime. That knowledge shaped his restraint. Mansa Musa understood that some people are placed in history not to be comfortable, but to hold a line until others can stand behind them. In this way, his later reign was not about expansion or display. It was about endurance. He governed as a man aware that symbols do not get to rest. They only get to hold. When Mansa Musa passed from the world, Mali did not collapse overnight. Gold still moved. Cities still stood. Schools still taught. Yet something essential had shifted. The empire remained, but the balance he had held with such discipline loosened. What followed was not immediate ruin, but gradual unraveling, the kind that begins when a great presence leaves a space too large to fill. Those who came after him inherited wealth, but not the weight he carried. They ruled land, but not the moment in history he had occupied. Mansa Musa had stood at a rare intersection, where power, faith, knowledge, and global attention converged in one life. That convergence does not repeat easily. When it passed, The structure around it weakened. Historians often describe Mali's decline in terms of invasion and politics. But beneath those forces lay something quieter. The empire had reached a height that demanded exceptional steadiness to maintain. Without a figure able to carry both authority and symbol, pressure began to show. Gold alone could not hold what memory had once reinforced. Yet, to speak only of decline is to misunderstand legacy. Mansa Musa did not fail by leaving behind a world that changed. All worlds change. His achievement was that, for a time, he forced history to widen its frame. He made it impossible to speak of global civilization without acknowledging Africa's depth and discipline. Long after his death, maps still showed his image. Stories still circulated. Scholars and travelers continued to speak his name. Even when Mali's power faded, memory did not. That endurance mattered. It meant that Africa's presence in history could not be reduced to absence again without effort. For those who came later, his life remained a reference point, not a standard easily met, but a reminder of what had once been visible. Mansa Musa proved that African leadership could operate on the world stage without surrendering identity. He showed that dignity could be expansive rather than defensive. His story also carried a warning. Peaks reached through responsibility are harder to maintain than peaks built through force. The higher the standard, the greater the strain on those who follow. In this way, his legacy was both gift and burden. What remained after him was not an empire frozen in time, but a memory strong enough to challenge erasure. Mansa Musa left behind more than structures. He left behind evidence. Evidence that Africa had stood openly, confidently, and intelligently before the world. And once evidence exists, it cannot be undone. It can only be ignored or remembered. He ensured it would be remembered. There are lives that end, and there are lives that remain. Mansa Musa belongs to the second kind. Long after his footsteps faded from the roads to Mecca, long after gold stopped flowing through his hands, the shape of what he proved stayed behind. He showed the world, if only briefly, what it looked like when African leadership stood without apology. He did not win by conquest. He did not demand belief. He chose responsibility when escape was easier. He chose learning when fear would have ruled faster. He chose dignity when spectacle would have drawn louder praise. These were not small decisions. They were human ones, and they carried cost. If there is one truth, his life leaves us. It is this: greatness does not announce itself with noise. It arrives through consistency, through restraint, through the quiet refusal to become smaller than history expects. Mansa Musa understood that standing upright was not arrogance. It was obligation to those who came before and those who would come after. For many of us listening today, his story feels familiar in ways history books never explain. The pressure to represent more than ourselves, the burden of being watched, the demand to be excellent, just to be accepted. Mansa Musa carried that weight centuries ago, and he carried it without bitterness. That is why his memory still steadies us. This is why his name belongs among the great history legends. Not because of wealth, but because of what he did with it. His life reminds us that African history is not a footnote, but a foundation. The historical facts are clear for those willing to look honestly. Africa has stood at the center of human civilization before, and it can stand there again. Some people listen to stories like this late at night, letting them settle into memory like a calm voice meant for rest, almost like history for sleep. Others hear them as a call to remember what was deliberately forgotten. However you hear it, Let this story do its work gently. Mansa Musa does not ask us to imitate his power. He asks us to remember our posture, to remember that dignity is not granted by outsiders. It is practiced daily, passed quietly, defended patiently. That lesson belongs not only to kings, but to families, to communities, to anyone raising children who deserve to know they come from strength. As long as stories like this are told, Black history cannot be erased. It can be delayed. It can be distorted. But it cannot disappear. Because memory lives wherever people choose to stand upright together. And so the story does not truly end here. It rests, waiting for the next voice to carry it forward.